As food production increases, we call this intensification. And intensive cultivators are sedentary. There's no longer the need to move around from place to place, spot to spot, finding productive land, finding food to forage, or having places for animals to go. But it can be produced right where it is. Agricultural economies grow increasingly specialized. So now some people will do the work of planting and harvesting. Others will do the work of, we see in this picture, for example, a plow being used. And in specialized societies where there's specialization, you may have a person whose sole responsibility is building, repairing, and maintaining the plows, the farming equipment. Or there may be others who produce the baskets that are used to collect the food in, all kinds of things. And now, rather than everybody doing the same thing or large groups of people doing the same thing, it becomes specialized. Things become specialized. Very oftentimes, there's maybe one or a few caloric staples, particular crops that are grown again. We start talking about specialization again, and the other foods that are gained through trade and distribution, which we'll talk about in a minute. The types of animals that are raised will be different in the situation because now domesticated animals are used for the production process, but also to be consumed, but types of animals that are used. Because you now have large groups of people, you have, uh, in very often, many cases, wealth of resources and all of those kinds of things. Agricultural economies could pose some regulatory issues that central governments often have arisen to solve. You have issues of land ownership, issues of fair economic policies, and all of that that can happen once people become sedentary. We now move on to pastoralism. We now move to pastoralism. Pastoralists are herders whose activities focus on domesticated animals. We look at cattle, sheep, goats, camels, and yaks. And pastoralists are very serious about their animals. They do all that they can to protect them and to ensure that they continue to reproduce in return for the food and other project products that come from the animals that they've domesticated. They use the herds for food, but not only that, they will use the byproducts of herds for many other things. It may be that they will use the milk from certain animals that produce milk. They may use their hides for clothing, for shelter. They may use other byproducts. You can think in many cases the dung of certain animals may be used as fuel for fires, all kinds of things that are a part of what pastoralists benefit from the, the animals that they maintain. Before the Industrial Revolution, we would find pastoralism almost completely in the old world. Pastoral nomadism is where there are members of that society that follow the herd throughout the year, but there are other groups of people that don't. So we talk about transhumans, or that where part of the group moves with the herd, but most of them stay home in the village and support those who actually do go out with the animals, with the herds. When we look at modes of production now, when we talk about economy, the definition is a system for the production, distribution, and consumptions of resources. And we talk about mode of production, which is a way of organizing production. We look at the social relations through which labor is deployed to wrest energy from nature using tools, skills, organization, and knowledge. But mode of production, how things are extracted, how things are organized, all of that, the labor that is done in order to produce. Non industrial In non-industrial societies, there's again a division of economic labor that's related to age and gender. That's something that we find across cultures, so we call it a cultural universal. But we also see that there are specific tasks that are assigned to each sex and each age, depending upon the particular culture. There will be tasks that will be assigned to men, some that are assigned to women, some that are for older people, younger people, all of that, and it will vary. When we begin to talk about means or factors of production, and we talk about the differences in foragers and food producers, for example, when it comes to land, that for foragers, the idea of land and land ownership is not as important, it's less permanent for foragers because they are moving around to areas where they can find food, find animals to hunt, find places to fish, and they will move following those patterns. And so land is less, the idea of land is less permanent than it is for food producers. With food producers, the idea of land and land ownership comes into play because, again, the land that is there, being able to continue to cultivate it and invest time, energy, and resources for it to produce becomes more important. So, who has access and rights to it, and that can be determined through kinship and also marriage. And it's not unusual for when we talk about marriage and the alliances that it forms, it's not unusual for marriages to take place to ensure access to certain plots of land. Let's move on to talk about modes of production. When we look at the labor, the tools, and specialization with regard to modes or ways of production, in non industrial societies, access to land and labor comes through social links. We talked about marriage and kinship just a moment ago. And we also have to look at as things continue to expand, that in industrial economies, what we call alienation can happen. And that's where factory workers will produce things for sale and for the benefit of their employer's profit, but things that they may not actually use. And so they may become alienated from the actual things that they produce. And so there's very little connection because it's not seen as something being important to the individual because it has very little connection with their life other than them gaining their livelihood from the production of it. So if we recap and look at Cohen's adaptive strategies and the features that are a part of that, we can see on this chart a summary of what it is that we've covered with regard to foraging, horticulture, agriculture, pastoralism, and industrialism. So let's talk now about economy. Let's talk about economizing and maximization. So we are going to look at how our production, distribution, and consumption organized in different societies and what motivates people in different cultures to produce, distribute, or exchange and consume. And the way that anthropologists study this or look at this is they do so from a cross-cultural perspective to gain an understanding. So we're going to talk about now distribution and exchange and market principle and the like. The market principle is that buying and selling and valuation are based on supply and demand. And the characteristic of market principle exchanges is bargaining, individuals trying to gain the best from um, economic relationship. And so bargaining becomes an important part of this process. Redistribution is the flow of goods into a center and then back out. That's something that we characteristically find in chiefdoms. Um, When we start talking about money in that respect, then we start looking at states where we think about the fact that governments collect taxes, for example, that being the central point, and then distributing back out in government services. When we talk about, you will hear the term sometimes, your tax dollars at work, but that's what we're referring to with that. But redistribution, taking goods, taking money, taking those things and bringing them into a central point, and then spreading them back out or sending them back out again, found in chiefdoms, found in states, all of that. Reciprocity. There's generalized reciprocity, and that's giving without a specific expectation of an exchange. We can think about this in terms of a parent doing for a child, giving for a child, providing for a child without an expectation of a specific expectation of something giving back in return. We call that generalized reciprocity. There's balanced reciprocity where there are exchanges between people who are more distantly related than members of the same band or household. And usually these exchanges are of fairly equal value. And one person gives and the other person gives, and there's an exchange, and it's balanced. And then there's finally negative reciprocity. And usually this comes in where they're dealing with people on the outside or on the fringes of a social system. There can oftentimes be distrust. One of the examples I like to use a great deal in class setting is that of dealing with a car dealership. Now we know things have changed because you have now some services, online services, and others that there are no haggling pricing, but still the conventional method of buying a car where you go into the dealership and the dealer is trying to maximize their profit by selling the car at the highest rate possible, and the buyer or purchaser is trying to maximize their savings by paying as little as possible. And there's a going back and forth that happens, that takes place in the games that happen as a result of that, trying to get the best price for each person, trying to gain benefit for each person. And we call this negative reciprocity. And this marks the end of part two of making a living. Reciprocity is an exchange between social equals. This is something that we'll find in egalitarian societies. And that's where people who are related by kinship, marriage, or close personal ties and see themselves as social equals. And so there's an exchange that takes place, and we call that reciprocity. And in most cases where there is a reciprocal process, as I mentioned in egalitarian societies, the idea, when we talk about forgers, for example, of saying thank you is something that is unheard of, and as a matter of fact, would be frowned upon in many ways because it then would signal that there's some type of imbalance in the exchange there. So many cultures even lack a word, an expression for thank you. We'll talk about the three types of reciprocity.